Banking union is one of the major projects in order to complete and deepen EMU. People are talking a lot about risk reduction and risk sharing. I think this is, in a certain way, it's a misnomer, because risk sharing implies not necessarily that you reduce risks, because if you reduce them to zero, there's nothing left, but that you have joint control over how risks are generated. This creates trust, and if you trust, then you share. So I prefer to talk about banking union being completed by deposit insurance. This requires risk sharing, of course, and in order for all countries and actors to share risk, you want to know how they are generated and how they are controlled. This can be by a single institution, ECB, single supervisor, commission, single resolution board, but it needs to be done.
When the crisis hit, there was no mechanism to help countries in distress. So the Union went through a process of learning by doing, and starting with the Greek support that was delivered through bilateral loans. Then we moved into developing temporary institutions around the European Financial Stability Facility. And as the crisis kept deepening, the Union developed a permanent crisis resolution mechanism around the ESM. With the development of the European Stability Mechanism, the way in which official lending is deployed has changed. Traditional approach by the International Monetary Fund implies relatively short maturity loans at a relatively high spread. This is very different from what is being done in Europe, where the maturities are very long and the margins charged on the loans are very narrow. This has significant implications for the capacity of countries to access markets at different maturities.
I think it's a good time to discuss the issues in this ebook. We have a very favorable situation in financial markets where the degree of financial stress or systematic stress in the euro area has fallen considerably. And this, in my opinion, is the result of the phase of the business cycle, the massive policies put in place primarily by the ECB, and the institutional upgrades that we have already seen being delivered by policymakers. There is more to be done. In my opinion, the better outcomes will be achieved if an emphasis is placed on growth initiatives, because ultimately to rally populations around new institutions, well-being has to be achieved.
It's not just that courts played an important role in the response to the crisis, it's also that, and not just in this particular crisis, crises in general, some of the lessons learned are to reform rules, to create new kinds of constraints that might prevent crisis in the future. And typically one of the elements of those constraints is a reliance on courts in the future to enforce them when push comes to shove. And so the question for us really was, are courts likely to do that? And our short answer is, there are some significant limitations to judicial enforcement.
So this sort of raises the bigger question as to whether or not, when you're designing a system, you can depend on courts to rigorously enforce rules like the no bailout clause, particularly when you have deep financial crises. And I think one of the potential lessons, although much more research is undoubtedly required, one of the potential lessons is that courts are not the kinds of institutions that, when faced with such crises, are necessarily in the best position, either in terms of willingness to do tough things or capacity to do tough things, to enforce tough rules. And often their inclination is going to be to convert the rule into a much more malleable standard. Now, if you wanted a standard in the first place, that's fine. But if you wanted a rule in the first place, then don't blame the court when the rule is converted into a standard. So.